A very good day to everyone. I am Niloy Mukherjee, Assistant Professor at Techno India University, Kolkata. Welcome back to my series of sessions on law and literature, a critical perspective. In the last session, I spoke to you about the interrelationship of law and literature and elaborated on critical legal theories as a promising research interface between the two disciplines. Critical legal theory bases itself on the promise that law and justice is not innocent of power dynamics and politics, and established legal theories are biased to those in power, thereby acting as mere instruments in the hands of the powerful to victimize the powerless. Voicing the opinion of Nietzsche and Foucault, critical legal theorists suggest that law formalizes oppression, makes it respectable, and indoctrinates people to accept it. Drawing from Marxism, it argues that law, at least in the way it has historically developed, is a system of domination. In the last session, we discussed how critical legal theory addressed issues such as fundamental contradictions within society, the process of alienation by categorization and reification, the denial of the value of neutrality of law, and an alternative world of critical legality. Today, we would discuss a specific phenomena discussed in the domain of critical legal theory. The phenomena is termed as legal Orientalism. Legal Orientalism emerged as a subdiscipline of critical legal theory by combining insights from Edward Said's Orientalism. Said, in his book Orientalism, critically views Orientalism as a corporal institution for the domination of the West that functions through defining, restructuring, and authorizing views about the Orient. Through the process of Orientalism, the Orient is reduced to a passive, objectified other, that is, scrutinized by a morally, racially, cognitively superior Occidental self, that is, the West. Said problematizes this Orientalistic depiction and reveals the inherent politics involved in the process, the way the Western colonial powers still maintain their superiority on Eastern territories through posing as the superior self and propagating informal imperialism and non-territorial colonialism, forms that have been later identified, or contemporary forms of neocolonialism. These have been identified as the contemporary forms of neocolonialism. Eurocentrism as a concept seeped into other areas of knowledge, giving out several epistemic offshoots. Its influence on legal texts led to the evolution of legal Orientalism. In his seminal book, Legal Orientalism, the legal scholar Timur Ascola discusses the legal complicacies between USA, representing the Occident, the Western part of the world, and China, representing the Orient, the Eastern part of the world. To support its Oriental premise and maintain the superior status quo, the West often declares the Orient as lawless, thereby claiming their revered Occidental territories to be the inadvertent altars of justice. Oriental law has time and again been equated with despotism and held unfit to be real law. A renowned social legal scholar, Duncan Kennedy, claims international law must be understood in relation to a distinction between the West and the rest of the world. Thus, the binaries of the self and other becomes all the more relevant in this analysis because the dominant West repeatedly tries to maintain its position as the superior self by structuring and developing laws in its own terms that assigns an inferior status to the otherized East. In the modern hybrid cosmopolitan society, despite the claims of increasing practices of cultural diversity and multiculturalism, racial categories and differences continue to exist in less overt manifestations that particularly incorporate the biases of Western laws in terms of imperialism, colonialism, and racism. In their attempt to universalize legal liberalism, the Occident, the Western discourse, outrightly rejects all forms of Oriental legal systems, including the Confucian mandates, the Vedic scriptures, and the Islamic Sharia law, also the Egyptian law. All of these non-European legal systems have been placed by the Western discourse within a false dichotomy where it is characterized either to be extremely regressive, barbaric, inhumane, or to be extremely unstable and inconsistent to be considered as law. Both these representations attempt to construct the binary of non-European legal system versus democracy, pitting them as completely opposites. Ruscola identifies this formation of binaries, which validates the concept of legal Orientalism. He opines that by portraying China, read the Orient, as the inferior other, which is static, lacking in individual legal subjectivity, and confused, the West is pronounced as the superior self that is progressive, rational, just, proper, enlightened, so on. Law's contradictions, according to Ruscola, cannot be resolved but only be managed. And one way of managing them is by projecting them elsewhere on the other. I mean to say, the Oriental territories, the Oriental legal and the moral codes, thereby cleansing the self. And here we are reading the self as the Western continent, the Western discourse, the Western morality, the Western legality. So cleansing the Western polity of the inferiority altogether. The Western discourse has repeatedly portrayed the different regions of the Orient, say for example, China, Iran, Afghanistan, Japan, Vietnam, as major lawbreakers, sort of violator of law. While America and the other European countries like Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, all of the, erstwhile colonial countries, has been portrayed taking upon itself the task of being the global law enforcer, the chosen nations and the nationalities holding the responsibility of administering programs for the promotion of rule of law on a global scale. A diffuse set of European prejudices about the Oriental law shaped the Western ideology about Oriental lawlessness, thereby justifying their practice of empire and colonization. This resulted in the enforcement of an extraterritorial body which functioned as an extension of the erstwhile colonizing countries in the apparently lawless Orient, in order to discipline them, in order to make the Oriental subject as a legal subject, as a law-abiding subject. Now, the study of legal Orientalism, therefore, attempts to examine several interrelated narratives about what is and what is not law, and who, in fact, are its true subjects. It also asks the uncomfortable question as to who has the law, that is, who governs the content, course, and direction of what we consider to be legal, ideal, just. The distinction between the lawful Occident and the unlawful Orient in legal Orientalist discourse is crucial, precisely because law has been repeatedly identified as a marker of modernity. Thus, the US being modern, the West being modern, Europe being modern, is expected to embody modern values in law, while the law of the Orient is supposed to be presumed to be outdated, primitive, savage, and almost non-existent in the light of modernity. For the modern world, the state is the primary medium for the articulation of the universal, and law is the privileged language in which that universality is expressed. Therefore, by depicting the Orient as a lawless land, the Western self robs the Orient of its agency, of its language to express itself, something which is expected to be universal, thereby positioning the Orient as the inferior, immoral, unjust other, distinct from the superior moral just self of the Western world. In the legal Orientalist discourse, the Western law emerges as the paradigmatic instance, a sort of global standard of law for constituting free individual subjects and democratic objectives of a nation state. Therefore, any law which differs from this defined Western standard fails to qualify as a universal legal mandate, and any state which follows it is relegated to a lawless savage land and an inferior, indistinct, undemocratic Oriental other. Legal Orientalism is, in fact, a discourse of, like I've mentioned, a way of world making and self making through law, which involves unarticulated cultural assumptions. This is very important. The assumptions, the presumptions on the part of the Western world are unarticulated, assumptions, half truths about the lawless, uncivil Orient. Ruscola defines this as a social technology through which the Western discourse produces a definition of the world in which it exists and the subject whom it disciplines. Once this hegemonic binary has been established, this discourse of inferiority and difference of the Oriental, unlegal, despotic, savage helps define the identity of the Western self as imbued with legal modernity. Drawing from such a perspective, the Western man becomes a progressive, historic individual defined by his culture, his ability to empathize, his sophistication of culture and his modernity, that the European has drawn since the rise of Renaissance. While the Orient and the Oriental man became a symbolic object left stagnant in history, segregated in time and space. The Western self is established as a legal subject, while the Oriental person emerges as the non-legal, non-subject, the other. Thus, we see how law emerges from being written mandates to a discursive apparatus that Foucault talks about and that I have referred to in my previous lecture, which shapes the subject's sense of identity. Voicing the similar arguments that Edward Said had presented in Orientalism, Ruscola observes that the legal contradictions, the social complications, cannot be resolved but can only be projected onto an inferior other, and provides a basis for the formation of the Orient in the Western discourse, which functions as the foil onto which the inferior identity could be vested, which becomes the normative underclass of the international legal order, where rampant bombings can happen, detention can happen, killing of civilians is normalized, aggression and emergency is naturalized, and international law can be interpreted arbitrarily, applied selectively, and enforced punitively. Appropriation of other resources on the pretext of civilization, development, modernization, or alternative dispute resolution is justified, and lack of Western rule of law in Oriental lands is used to justify the positional superiority of the West and legitimize the Western aggression, the colonial violence, the colonial plunder. The Western literature, the Eurocentric discourses, provides us with numerous examples to validate the idea that I have been trying to propound over here in the previous slides in this lecture. So Montesquieu, in his book, The Spirit of the Laws, associates monarchies and republics with Europe, but despotism to the Oriental nations in Africa, the Red American communities, and Asia. For Hegel too, the Chinese, and read it as an extension of the Orient, the Chinese do not exist as individual subjects, but they are merely non-thinking entities ruled by a despotic ruler. He opines that the Orient is unable to distinguish between law and morality, and the Oriental sovereign expresses moral values as laws which the subject comply to not by virtue of any inherent morality, because in the first place they are non-subjects incapable of any such morality, but owing to the fear of any punishment. Max Weber, the anthropologist, highlights the theocratic nature of the Islamic law as the reason for the downfall of the Islamic polity, the Islamic nations. He says Muslims treat legal prescriptions in exactly the same manner that they treat ceremonial and ritual norms. The law for them is therefore the sacred law. He confirms that the power of logos, that is, logic, the ability to define and reason, is denied to the Orient, This leads to the natural presumption that Oriental laws are contradictory to common sense and justice. Brian Turner, a prominent social legal scholar, comments that Islamic law provided society with a tight normative structure which fails to evolve rationally to meet the ever-changing demands of the contemporary society. The famous British-German author of the 20th century, Joseph Staat, in his book Origins of Mohammedan Jurisprudence, stated that most of what is considered to be the Islamic law is actually a fabrication. It is fixed in time and unwelcoming of changes, and is effectively, and the law, the Mohammedan law, effectively rejects human reason and justice. Raskola, in his book Legal Orientalism, cites an example from the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a very specific US Orientalistic rhetoric, which suspended Chinese immigration into the country and prevented Chinese inhabitants of the US from getting citizenship, claiming them to be non-legal subjects incapable of understanding US laws. Patricia Crone, another social legal scholar, emphasized on the impossibility of Islamic law as an effective legal system because of its substantive focus on morals rather than justice. Lawrence Rosen's book on Islamic legal culture in The Anthropology of Justice and the Justice of Islam, that's the name of the book, The Anthropology of Justice and Justice of Islam by Lawrence Rosen. Here, the author argues that the Islamic society is best understood through its totalitarian control on its subjects via moral and religious dictums. All of these examples that I have stated over here reinforce the Western notions that the Orient is cut away from the course of time and progress, and it is incapable of legality, an absolute other distinct from the progressive, legal, humanitarian superior West. Thus, the Orient emerges as an anti-model that symbolizes everything that the West does not want to be or admit to be. Analyzing the reiteration of the similar ideas over centuries in Western discourse, one arrives to the natural presumption that Oriental laws are contradictory to common sense and justice. It is such a conceptualization of the Orient as lawless and despotic that is used by the West in rationalizing their extraterritorial jurisdiction and the Oriental and the non-Occidental territories, the non-Occidental countries. The idea that the Western intervention, the white intervention, in ensuring the rule of law is solicited by these countries to become modern and civilized. So all of the colonial rules was to a certain extent solicited on the part of the Oriental territories. As a consequence, the law of the Orient fails to become a primary entity in itself and is reduced to a secondary entity that serves to conform to or conform to or differ from Western theories of law. In this sense, the narrative of the modern world becomes a story of the violent exclusion of others outside of Europe, first on the basis of religion and then cultural difference. Law, in turn, becomes a medium not for a global recognition of universality, but the differential, biased allocation of universality across the globe. Thus, the phenomena of legal Orientalism propagates the view that people of large parts of the world are incapable of developing democratic, efficient, and just governments and require American, or as an extension, the European, the Western intervention to achieve modernity and economic growth comparable to the West. The American man, the American subject, the European subject, is thus burdened with a white lawyer's burden that compels them to intervene into these lawless lands and provide their lawless natives with the modern Western law, with the European Renaissance. This self-assigned responsibility of the West to dole out law and justice to the East is analogous to that of the white man's burden to supposedly bring civilization to the uncivilized natives of the Orient by colonizing them. The prejudices regarding the Orient and therefore the Oriental law as inferior are embedded in the psyche of individuals, including statesmen, judges, academicians, and students, and they become conditioned in the biases of the dominant mainstream culture of the West. They understand themselves and create their own identities necessarily in relation and in contrast to this inferior Oriental other as the legal, humanitarian, and the just selves. Okay, so all of these Western individuals identify them on the basis of the Western discourse to be legal, and because of the humanitarian concern, on the basis of the humanitarian concern and the justness of the cause. As a result, even after highlighting the aforementioned complications within the existing legality, the existing legal discourse within our society, within our culture, legal Orientalism survives as a discourse even in today's post-colonial times, because today, as ever before, law will always need its other to project the apparent inferiority within it. So with that, we come to the end of our session today. In the next session, we would apply the concept of legal Orientalism to the critical analysis of colonial and post-colonial literatures. Thank you so much for your patience. Have a good day.